This is Advanced Math, Unit 4, Lesson 3. Graph y equals cosine of x. Yesterday we did y equals sine of x. Today we are doing y equals cosine of x. Number one, we're going to graph y equals cosine of x. We're going to do the same thing we did on yesterday's lesson. First thing I'm going to do over here is make my quadrantals. 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. All right, y equals cosine of x. This is x, this is y, and y is cosine. And like I said in the last lesson, we're going to pick up all the quadrantals, so that's 0, pi over 2, and then pi, 3 pi over 2, and then back to 2 pi, which is where we started at the 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There will always be 5 key points. Cosine is the x value, so at 0 it is 1, pi over 2 it is 0, at pi it is negative 1, 3 pi over 2 is 0, and back to 2 pi it is once again 1. Alright, 1, negative 1. And like I said before, I usually go to the end and I put the 2 pi, and then I try my best to cut that in half, call that pi, cut that in half, call that pi over 2, which would make this 3 pi over 2, 1 over 2, 2 over 2, which is 1, 3 over 2, 4 over 2, which is the 2. All right, and then we have 0, 1, pi over 2 is 0, pi is negative 1, 3 pi over 2 is 0, and 2 pi is 1. So you have this half a hill, a complete valley, and then half a hill. Half a hill, a valley, and a hill. This is your cosine graph, or the cup shape, however you want to think of it. The sine is the snake shape and the cosine is the cup shape. This is your cosine graph. So knowing what we know, those 5 key points are going to stretch depending on what the amplitude is. Or flip, if it's negative, it's going to reflect across the x-axis. So could we graph number 2, y equals negative without a t-chart, knowing what we know? Okay, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and put it down here. One, 2, negative 1, negative 2. And I know I'm going to have the 5 key points up to 2 pi. Cut 2 pi in half, that is pi. Cut that in half, it's pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. Okay, so the 5 key points for the cosine graph, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. Stretching it up with an amplitude of 2, remember amplitude is always positive, amplitude of 2, it's going to come up to 2, 0, negative 2, 0, 2. And then the negative sign is going to reflect it. So instead of starting at 2, it's going to start at negative 2. 0 is going to stay 0. Then this maximum is going to come up to 2, back to 0, and then down to -2. So we had half a hill, a valley, half a hill. Now I have half a valley, a hill, and half a valley. And it got stretched out because the amplitude is now 2. Okay. So what are we going to be seeing today? Y equals A cosine bx. And I believe this B piece right here is the piece that you've not yet seen. The amplitude changing you've seen before. The B part you have not. Okay, so just a review. Amplitude is not just A, it is the absolute value of A. Now your period is what we're going to have that's new. Period is always going to be 2 pi over B. Your period is the amount of time it takes for you to start and end your graph. And prior to this here, our period has always been 2 pi. We started at 0, we ended at 2 pi. We start and end within the length of 2 pi. Same thing here. It stretched, but it flipped as well, but it still started at 0 and ended at 2 pi. And the same was true with yesterday's lesson. All of the graphs we had started at 0 and ended at 2 pi. So, with that being said, our period now is going to be 2 pi over B, meaning the period is not always going to be 2 pi. Okay, so I am going to bubble. These are things you do have to know. You will need to know. Okay, so let's graph. Actually, I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to graph on the back. We are going to graph the following. Number 1, y equals cosine 2x. Okay, what you always look for first is the amplitude. Your amplitude is the absolute value of your leading coefficient. It's still 1. Your period is 2 pi over 2 because your B here is 2. 2 pi over 2 reduces to pi. So your period is simply pi, meaning you're going to start and end within the length of pi. So I'm going to say 2 pi is way out here, then pi would be around here. So I'm going to start and end within this length here. Now eventually you're not going to want to draw your graphs really squished. You will stretch pi out a little bit more. For now I'm going to leave it. You take pi and you cut in half just like you did before. Pi cut in half is pi over 2. Now remember earlier we had 2 pi. 2 pi cut in half was pi. Pi cut in half was pi over 2. And we just counted 1 over 2, 2 over 2, 3 over 2. But you could do 2 pi plus 1 pi is 3, and 3 cut in half is 3 pi over 2. Same thing here. 1 pi plus 2 pi is 3, and 3 pi cut in half is 3 pi over 2. Okay, so pi over 2 cut in half is pi over 4. The easiest thing to do is count. You could do pi plus pi over 2 and cut in half, but it's easiest if you can find a pattern. Here's 1 over 4, 2 over 4. That would make this 3 pi over 4 and this 4 over 4. And let's just check if that's correct. 1 over 4, 2 over 4 indeed is 1 over 2, and 4 over 4 is indeed 1 pi. 1 over 4, 2 over 4, 3 over 4, 4 over 4. Or you can see that it's increasing by halves, by quarters. 1/4 plus 1/4 is a half, half plus 1/4 is 3/4, and 3/4 plus 1/4 is pi. Okay, and the amp we said was still 1, and it is positive, so it's the cup shape that starts with the maximum of 1, and then it has a 0, then it goes down to -1, 0, maximum. I'm just going to show you, I'm going to flip this over really quick. Maximum 0, minimum 0, maximum. We're doing the same thing because it is positive cosine. Only thing is the period changed, so it's squishing in. It's all finishing within this piece right here. All right, so here we go, our half a hill, a valley, and half a hill. And there's our beautiful tiny cosine graph, but still a cosine graph. Okay, number 2. Y equals -5/2 cosine pi over 2 x. Y equals -5/2 cosine pi over 2x. Amplitude is 5/2. Period is 2 pi divided by pi over 2, which is 2 pi times multiplied by the reciprocal 2 over pi. Do some reducing, and what does your period come out to be? 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and graph. Now notice this is 4, not 4 pi, it's 4. Okay, 5/2, you can go up 5/2 and down 5/2, or you can do the math. 5 over 2 is 2.5. You can kind of estimate, as long as you label, you're good. 5/2, -5/2. I'm just going to put the 4 out here and then start doing all the cutting in half. 4 cut in half is 2. 2 cut in half is 1. That means this is 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. It is negative, which means instead of doing max 0, min 0, max, I'm going to flip it. Minimum 0, max 0, minimum. Okay, so starting at my minimum, 0, max 0, minimum. And that's how the cup shape works, only it's reflected across the x-axis. So now I have half a valley, a hill, and half a valley. All right, so I'm hoping this makes sense. Keep in mind, if you have any questions, you are ready to ask them in class tomorrow. Okay, we're going to try another one. Number 3. Y equals 2 sine of 4x. Y equals 2 sine of 4x. Amplitude is 2, and it's always positive. Period is 2 pi over b, and b is 4. 2 pi over b, and b is 4. Reduce. Your period is pi over 2. And -2. Now a period of pi is going to, pi over 2. Now I'm definitely going to have to stretch this out, because that means I will start and end my graph in that little piece right there. If I were to graph this on the same graph, I would start and end all within that little piece right there. Now that's too hard to squish in when I'm graphing, so I'm going to stretch it out a little bit more, meaning I'm going to put my pi over 2 out this far. Now that's definitely a lot farther than I have it over here, but because I'm putting it on a separate graph, a different graph, it is okay. So I'm going to put that as my pi over 2. Pi over 2 cut in half. 1/2 of a half is 1/4, so pi over 4. a half of 1/4, multiply 1/4 by 1/2, you get pi over 8. And then look for the pattern, 1 over 8, 2 over 8, 3 over 8, 4 over 8. Let's see if that worked. 1 over 8 stays. 2 over 8 does indeed reduce to the pi over 4. And then I'm going to have 3 pi over 8. And 4 pi over 8 does indeed reduce to pi over 2. How are you doing? All right, so it does work, and I'm going to have an amplitude of 2, and it's positive, so maximum 0, minimum 0, maximum. And I'm going to erase those points because I got carried away and assumed I was graphing cosine, so I apologize if I confused anybody. I am going to be graphing sine, and sine is not the cup shape like these two. It is the snake shape, which means you start at 0, maximum 0, minimum 0. And let me get rid of all those little scuffy marks everywhere. Okay, so that was 0, maximum, 0, minimum, 0. So it is the hill and then the valley. And there is your sine, y equals 2 sine of 4x. And that is it for this lesson.